Cluster bombs. Biden defends decision to send Ukraine controversial weapons.
Here's a summary of the article.
U.S. President Joe Biden has defended his very difficult decision to give Ukraine cluster bombs, which have a record of killing civilians. Spain's defense minister Margarita Robles told reporters her country had a firm commitment that certain weapons and bombs could not be sent to Ukraine. No to cluster bombs and yes to the legitimate defense of Ukraine, which we understand should not be carried out with cluster bombs, she said. The U.S., Ukraine and Russia have not signed up to the convention, and both Moscow and Kyiv have used cluster bombs during the war. Ukraine's defense minister has given assurances the cluster bombs would not be used in urban areas and only to break through enemy defense lines. Mr. Sullivan told reporters the American cluster bombs being sent to Ukraine were far safer than those he said were already being used by Russia in the conflict. Mr. Biden's move will bypass U.S. law prohibiting the production, use or transfer of cluster munitions with a failure rate of more than 1%. Early on in the war, when the White House was asked about allegations that Russia was using cluster and vacuum bombs, the then press secretary said it would be a potential war crime if true.
This post received a score of 6,700, with an upvote ratio of 93%. Here are the top comments in response to this article.
TLDR. Ukraine agrees to use cluster munitions in its fight against Russia, following 5 principles that limit their use and impact. The 5 principles. 1. Not to use cluster munitions in cities or on Russian territory. 2. To keep records of affected areas. 3. To inform partners about the use of cluster munitions. 4. To clear mines after the war. 5. To limit the impact of cluster munitions on civilians. The U.S. provides Ukraine with a new defense aid package that includes cluster munitions.
Worth noting, Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of the war. The difference being, Russian cluster bombs have a dud rate of like 50%, which is the main reason they tend to be banned. Kids step on one decades later and lose a foot or worse. We'll be hearing about people dying from long-forgotten remnants of this war for decades.
I can only imagine 70-year-old me reading up on how one of these bombs detonated.
They still find unexploded World War II-era bombs in Europe. Here is a recent one.
Hell, they find plenty enough WW1 munitions, especially in the red zones in France.
U.S. national parks are constantly finding unexploded shells from the Indian Wars and Civil War.
I watch a guy on YouTube who does a bunch of metal detecting. He has piles of Civil War munitions. He has a shed away from his house with a drill rig set up to drill into the stuff from a distance in case it's still live.
The Civil War had explosive munitions?
Yeah, they had extensive trench systems as well. In some ways it was the first industrial war.
The American Civil War is actually seen as the first modern war, so you're right.
The Russians have been using them since the opening stages of the war. Ukraine, Russia and the US also aren't signatories to the convention against using them. Between the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, mass rape, actively targeting Ukraine civilians, and Russia withdrawing from the Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians in a War Zone, I have absolutely no problem with Ukraine defending itself. Russia is clearly engaged in a genocidal action, and this is the second time they've tried to do so in 100 years. The first when they intentionally starved 5 million Ukrainians to death during the Holodomor.
Hijacking the top comment, giving cluster munitions to Ukraine is not a new moral decision for any part in this war. Both Ukraine and Russia has been using cluster munitions before this.
There's a strong argument to be made that supplying Ukraine with US-made bombs is the most humane option if Ukraine has been using Soviet or Ukrainian designs throughout the war. The failure rate of ours are likely much lower than whatever they're using now, which means fewer time bombs waiting to take out a child in a few decades.
This video was automatically created by Reddit to speech. The article and comments in this video were selected from Reddit according to their upvotes, and any paraphrasing was performed by smmry.com, without any human intervention.